Hello. In our diets there are only three macronutrients: protein, fat and carbohydrate, and one of them is supposed to be bad for us, and we are advised to restrict it. For decades, dietary fat has been vilified, and we're told to choose low-fat or fat-free products, to eat lean meat, low-fat yogurt, skim milk and all the rest of them. We have been encouraged to develop a fear of dietary fat. Why do the National Dietary Guidelines recommend that we replace fat with carbohydrate in our diet? They believe that fat is bad for us. I'll explain more about that later. And that only leaves carbohydrate and protein. So to make our meals, to have enough energy in our meals, they need to increase the amount of carbohydrate we eat, because protein is expensive and no one's going to eat just protein, though some people do. So why do they spread a fear of fat? What do they fear in fat? Well, it is a story of bad science, egos, political compromises and corruption. It is not a story of nutritional science. But let's start with a bit of science. We're often told that too much fat in the diet clogs our arteries. And this shows the type of diagram you'll often see when an organisation is talking about. The NHS actually produces documents like this, which suggests that fat sticks to the inside of our arteries, like a fatberg in the sewer. This is not true. This is not what happens. Our bodies are far too clever to let this happen. When people do get a problem with narrowing of the arteries, it is because there is swelling in the artery wall, not sticking to the inside of it. Why this happens I will explain in another video. But for now, let's have a look at some chemistry. We're told that among the world of fat, saturated fat is the worst. So what is the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat? Let's have a quick look, because chemistry is such good fun. This diagram represents a saturated fatty acid molecule and an unsaturated fatty acid molecule. They're all made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, as designated by C, H and O. A fatty acid is simply a long chain of carbon atoms attached to each other, with hydrogen atoms attached to the carbon atoms. On the left-hand end of each molecule there is a group that has some oxygen atoms in. That's known as a hydroxyl group, and it is very slightly acidic, which is why they're called fatty acids. A saturated fatty acid is simply a molecule saturated with hydrogen atoms. You can't get any more hydrogen atoms into that molecule. It's full. I'm sure you remember from your chemistry lessons that carbon has a valency of 4, which means it can make 4 connections with other atoms, and hydrogen has a valency of 1 and oxygen 2. Now, the difference when we come down to the unsaturated fatty acid is that there is one place in the chain of carbon atoms which is not full of hydrogen atoms, and there are 2 hydrogen atoms missing, and the carbon atoms make a double bond. Now, interestingly, that double bond makes the molecule bend, but apart from that, they're almost identical. Saturated fatty acids are supposed to be bad for us and unsaturated good for us, but that's a pretty small difference in a molecule to make such a wide sweeping statement. The interesting thing about this is that saturated fatty acids are straight, and therefore if you have a lot of them together, they can lie close together. Whereas the unsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which would have more than one double bond, are curved molecules, and if you have a lot of them together, they can't actually fit closely together, and that's why something with a lot of saturated fat in it, like butter or lard, is solid at room temperature, and something with more unsaturated fats in it, like olive oil, is liquid at room temperature. It's all just a matter of density and how close the molecules can get to each other. Isn't chemistry fascinating? So back to our story about why there is a fear of fat. It's all to do with heart attacks. Heart attacks had never really been seen prior to about 1920, but during the rest of that century they were steadily increasing. And they were increasing rapidly, and doctors were worried. And when the President of America, Eisenhower, had a heart attack in 1955. It was like a final straw, and people started to think, we really have to sort this out. Autopsies had shown that people, usually men, who died with a heart attack had swellings in their arteries, which are called plaque, and dissection showed that plaque contained a lot of cholesterol, and they assumed that cholesterol was the cause of heart attacks. The occurrence of something in the vicinity of a problem does not mean that that thing caused the problem. It may have done, but it does not prove that it caused it. Research had already been underway before Eisenhower's heart attack, and a researcher called Ansel Keys, who was an American with several degrees, but none of them in nutrition, was utterly convinced that cholesterol was the cause of heart disease, and that eating high amounts of fat in the diet increased the levels of cholesterol and therefore put you at more risk of heart disease. And he did some studies on this, and in the early 1950s he published something called his 6-country study, and he produced a graph which looks like this. This graph shows what's called degenerative heart disease in the people of 6 countries: Japan, Italy, England and Wales, Australia, Canada and the USA. The bigger graph, the higher graph, is for age 55 to 59, and the one lower down is for 45 to 49 year olds. On the vertical axis it is deaths per 1,000 people, which you can see in Japan is under 1, and in the USA the highest one is 7 out of 1,000 people. Along the horizontal axis, fat calories as a percentage of the total diet. There are several things to say about this. First of all, this is a correlation. It does not prove anything. There could be plenty of other explanations rather than what he's trying to imply. The fat calories as a percentage of total diet is a national average. There is no proof that the 7 people out of 1,000 in the USA who died of heart disease were eating a typical US diet. But the point is, this is not good science. You don't know what these individuals ate because he was looking at a national average. So it's a correlation. You don't know what the individuals ate, but it's actually much worse than this. When Ansel Keys published that graph, there was actually information available for 22 countries. But what he did was to cherry pick the 6 that would make a lovely looking graph to fit his criteria. This is a plot of the available data for 22 countries, and you can see it's much more scattered than he would have us believe. The red line is me cherry picking 6 countries and putting a red line through their plots to prove the exact opposite of what he did, just to show you that this is not good science. But it was taken very seriously and it formed policy. Ansel Keys was emboldened by his 6-country study, and he raised the funds for a 7-country study. But this time he and his team visited the countries involved and studied what the people ate. He was hard-working and ambitious, but the countries were not picked randomly. He still had no nutritional training, and he came into the study with a huge bias against saturated fat, and concluded that saturated fat in the diet increased the risk of heart disease. He pushed his ideas very hard, and he became quite famous and got his picture on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. We'll come back to him, but during the 1960s, America had a surprising amount of hunger and malnutrition because food was expensive. And to solve the problem, they set up a government committee to advise on the best diet. This was known as the United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. The chairman was Senator George McGovern, and it ran from 1968 to 1977. This committee ran for 9 years. Imagine the subcommittee's invested interests that would get involved in that. Imagine how much senators know about nutrition. This was the group that produced the National Dietary Guidelines, but obviously not before they had taken evidence from lots of experts. Many of the experts argued that there was no real evidence for fat being dangerous, and changing everybody's diet to high carbohydrate was an experiment on the entire population. Ansel Keys and others argued that they had to reduce saturated fat, and that meant cutting animal-based foods because he believed they were very high in saturated fat. The senators from states with large beef production were horrified, and they argued that it would bankrupt them. So, as all politicians do, they came to a political compromise and agreed to include the term lean meat in the dietary guidelines. And that is where lean meat advice came from. A political compromise, nothing to do with nutritional science. While this was going on, in the early 70s, a British researcher called John Yudkin claimed that too much sugar in the diet was actually causing heart disease, and he published a book called Pure, White and Deadly. He had plenty of good evidence to support his ideas, but he was vehemently attacked by Ancel Keys. But because Keys had such a following, Yudkin lost all credibility, and he lost his funding, and his career was ruined because of the attack by Keys. One of the final experts to testify to the McGovern Committee was Dr. Fred Stair, the esteemed head of Harvard's School of Public Health, and regarded as one of the nutritional experts in the country. He assured the committee that fat, not sugar, was the cause of heart disease, and this convinced them. However, it became apparent many years later that Dr. Stair had been bribed by General Foods to tell the committee that it was fat and not sugar, because they didn't want the recommendations to damage their business. The McGovern Committee recommended the high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet in 1977, and soon after the US government heavily subsidized wheat production. Everyone was encouraged to eat bread and cereals, which were cheap. So housewives were happy, and it was a big political win. Farmers were able to industrialize wheat production and were able to export their subsidized wheat all over the world and boost their balance of payments, another political win. The UK adopted these dietary guidelines in 1983, and many other countries around the world followed suit. What happened to our health after we changed our diets? Obesity rates turned upward almost immediately, and general health has declined. Health authorities continue to recommend the avoidance of dietary fat, especially saturated fat, despite the evidence against this decision. A comprehensive study in 2014 of all the countries in Europe and Russia, and some Middle Eastern countries, found the opposite to Keys. It was called the Pure Study. The Pure Study was a very comprehensive study, and it looked at 23 countries. They carefully examined the diet of everybody and produced this graphic showing the percentage of energy in the diet from fat. The darker red colours show countries with the highest intake of fat, and the lighter colours the countries with the lowest intake of fat. If we compare this to rates for heart disease, according to Keys, the colours should look the same, but this is what Pure found. The exact opposite. Deaths from heart disease, the highest numbers are the dark red colours, the lowest numbers are the lighter colours. Let's go back just to take another look. Percentage of fat in the diet of these countries compared to rates of heart disease in these countries. It is the exact opposite of what Keys said. It is the exact opposite of what we are told by the National Dietary Guidelines. A little earlier I showed you the cover of Time magazine from 1961, which featured Ancel Keys and his claim that saturated fats in the diet clogged arteries and caused heart disease. Well, in 2014, Time magazine changed their mind and they advised everybody to eat butter. They said the scientists were wrong about saturated fat. They don't cause heart disease after all. And all the evidence they showed in there, it's been ignored. In 2017, the British cardiologist Aseem Malhotra had a paper published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine entitled "Saturated Fat Does Not Clog the Arteries. Coronary heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition, the risk of which can be effectively reduced from lifestyle intervention." There's never been any evidence to show that saturated fat is bad for us. There is nothing to fear in eating butter. There is nothing to fear in eating the fat associated with meat. Our ancestors had been doing so for hundreds of thousands of years. I think the authorities need to stop feeding us lies. I hope to speak to you again soon, and in the meantime, I wish you good health.